Welcome to Liminal Radio, the niche horror podcast. This is Gray.
And this is Hatter. Welcome to the station between stations where we explore oddly specific horror topics.
And today we're going to be talking about how to kill a vampire, the powers and weaknesses of vampires throughout horror media.
We have a lot in the future we want to talk about with vampires, but today we'll focus on those subjects.
So, for starters, I think we kind of want to talk about folkloric origins and where the vampires came from, because that's really one of the things that massively influences their powers, their weaknesses, and where a lot of that came from is the original folklore. Now, we could get into things like the Strigoi, the Upir. There's a Filipino vampire called the Oswang. There's even a monkey like vampire from Australia. But we're not going to get too deeply into those because I feel like those are going to have a better place in something like a cryptid episode, which we are definitely going to be doing later.
Absolutely. And let me just say, I 100% believe that Australia has vampire monkeys.
I have seen nothing about Australia that makes me question them having vampire monkeys. So I'm totally down.
Absolutely. So, I do want to mention this. We mentioned the Upir. That's a Russian vampire story. As far as we know, that was the first vampire folklore. Now, it could have existed before that, but as far as the recorded history goes, that's our first vampire.
That is going to be the original origin of what we consider kind of the Western vampire of today. The Strigoi is a little bit different, has almost some more witchy tones, has some associations with owls, but is going to be in that same family. So those sorts of things, kind of from that Eastern European Russian tradition, is going to be where the core origin of our vampires is going to come from.
Now, do you want to talk about the history of the Oswang story, or should we save that for cryptids?
Let's save the deep thing of that for cryptids, other than just as a teaser for our cryptid episode. The Oswang is also sometimes called a tick tick for the weird noise it makes. And one of the things it's often depicted with is a proboscis like tongue and is often depicted as eating the unborn children out of women's stomachs. So, whenever we get into non European vampires, we get into some crazy stuff. We get into Chinese hopping vampires, we get into Japanese vampires that can remove their heads, we get into vampires that are essentially just witches. That there's going to be a ton of that, and that is definitely going to be in our vampire themed cryptid episode. There's going to be a lot in there. Stay tuned for that. That one's going to be fantastic.
Exactly. So, I think what we should move on to is abilities. I think that's one of the more interesting aspects of what a vampire is and tells us a little bit more about who they are as people.
100%. And whenever we start talking about those, then we're really talking about kind of what are core vampire abilities, and then what do we kind of see in some but not others. Because I feel like one of the things, and one of the reasons I wanted to do this episode specifically about this, well, as we say in the tagline, oddly specific topic, is that the differences between the powers and the weaknesses is one of the most interesting things about vampires. For instance, immortality is almost always there, but in some various different depictions, they're not necessarily immortal or they're conditionally immortal. So I feel like your immortality is like almost one of the defining characteristics of vampires. I can't think of any fiction in which a vampire ages. My wife just jumped in there with my best friend's vampire, pointing out that at least in that one movie they can age. But I'm going to say in 90% of vampire media, we're looking at ageless, immortal vampires.
Yeah, and often what we're talking about there is biological immortality. Like they don't age. That's a different type of immortality versus what people tend to think they can't be killed. Some are very much like that. They can't be killed. They can really only be stunned. And even if they do get incapacitated, they can be brought back. A great example is Vorator in Legacy of Kain ends up recapitated in Blood Omen 2. But we'll get to more about Legacy of Kain later in the episode.
And I do want to tell all the listeners that I guarantee you're going to hear all about Legacy of Kain. That is Hatter's favorite vampire media, and we are going to get a master class on it, and I'm looking forward to it.
Also, my favorite game series ever.
It's one of those games that I would probably consider underrated by most people because the fact that it hasn't had a new edition in a really long time means most people who don't play retro games just usually aren't familiar with it.
Also, super quick mention there are remasters coming December 10th of the two Soul Reaver games, but again, we'll get to Legacy of Kain later. What other abilities do we have for our vampire friends?
I feel like the But what I often in superhero discussions call the basic super soldier package, which is physical resilience, physical strength, and physical speed being higher than a normal human, is also pretty universal. Now in some of them it's much greater and some of it's much lesser, but overall I think we're almost always looking at some variation of the super soldier package. Now I will say I can think of one very notable vampire media where that's not the case, at least for one of them, and that's the resilience. Because I think when I think of vampires not being resilient, I think of Dusk Till Dawn. In Dusk Till Dawn, which is a Quentin Tarantino film, has Danny Trejo in it, and is overall just a really fun, kind of campy, gory vampire flick. One of the core weaknesses of their vampires is they have squishy bodies. So vampires actually are less resilient than a normal human. They're strong, they're fast, but you can literally pull one apart with your hands. You can take a table leg and stake it with it without it even being sharp because their bodies are squishy and you can stab them. They're also kind of snake related, which comes up in some other abilities we'll be discussing a little bit later as we're discussing those abilities.
Would you trade squishiness for strength and immortality and so forth?
Ooh, that's a really good one. I'm going to say I would. I would have to be very, very careful. You wouldn't want to be in a car wreck if you were that squishy because you might come apart. But given the fact that you have the immense strength, you have crazy speed, you have invulnerability, or rather not invulnerability, specifically you don't have invulnerability, but you do have immortality. I don't know. I'm thinking I would take it. What do you think, Hatter? Would you take it, the trade off?
I'm gonna say no because I'm really clumsy and I trip and fall a lot, and I stub my toe constantly, so I wouldn't have any toes left.
I 100% can see that because I am the type of person who would trip, fall, and decapitate myself.
Can they put their heads back on?
I don't think we ever see that. I actually think that's more the depiction of that they are kind of physically delicate. That's kind of why a ragtag bunch of humans were able to defeat them like they did. One thing we can definitely see the difference of, and the Dust Till Dawn vampires are a good example of this, is that you can definitely see a difference between antagonist vampires and protagonist vampires. And whenever they're designed to be an antagonist, they're either A, going to be really OP to present a really dangerous threat to the heroes, or they're going to be kind of underpowered like the Dust Till Dawn vampires so that the heroes have a fighting chance.
I also find that when they're in large groups, they tend to be weaker. Like, if you've seen 30 Days of Night, they're not weak, but, a little flash of light kills them.
Okay, that brings up one of my favorite storytelling tropes that's an excellent example of. It's called the conservation of ninjutsu. And what it means is in a story, a ninja or 10 ninjas present the equal amount of threat. If you have a hero and they are about to be attacked by a ninja, single ninja, that is going to be a certain level of dangerous threat that, is going to be a challenge for the hero. If, however, you have him attacked by 10 ninjas, it still represents roughly the same amount of threat. He's still going to have to struggle. If you have him attacked by 20 ninjas, again, he's going to have the same level of challenge and the same level of struggle, which means that the more ninjas you have, the less powerful each individual ninja by necessity has to be. Therefore, one ninja's worth of threat will have to be spread out over 20 ninjas or 100 ninjas. So no matter how many ninjas they have, they can only have one ninja's worth of threat.
Yeah, the same rule applies to zombies and werewolves too.
Yeah, pretty much any villain, any antagonist. So, like you said, in 30 Days of Night, in all these different things where we see massive amounts of zombies or vampires or whatever, they're never going to be as challenging as if we have a singular Dracula who's going to be way more dangerous. Now, that actually brings up a good thing when we're discussing these powers and abilities and that kind of stuff, that you have in almost every vampire media, there is a distinction between master vampires and lesser vampires, sometimes greater and lesser, sometimes master and slave vampires, sometimes type 1 and type 2 is also a term I've used. So it's important to acknowledge that, for instance, the type of immortality that a lesser vampire has, the greater vampire might have might have much more resilience.
Absolutely, and we see that in a lot of things actually. I know, for example, in Legacy of Kain, Kain raises his 7 lieutenants. They each get like some individual ability or power that allows them to survive in their environment or survive what they're going through. Whereas Kain just seems to be universally powerful.
And another vampire movie where it comes up and is a major plot point is John Carpenter's Vampires. We actually see a group of vampire hunters that are used to taking out vampires. The lesser vampires, they take them out all the time. They're not intelligent. They don't have a problem with them. The thing is, they're even used to taking out master vampires who are much more intelligent, much more powerful, and much more dangerous. And then, of course, the problem comes up is because they come up against a super master, which, like is often depicted in vampire media, is the progenitor. So you could almost say in vampire media, there's three levels. You have the lesser vampires, the greater or master vampires, and then you have the progenitor, whoever that is usually on a whole nother level.
Right. So you have your cashiers, your managers, and your regional managers.
Or the company founder.
Yeah, CEO, whatever have you. But yeah, like what else do we have on our list of powers here? Like a lot of these are pretty basic. Like you mentioned the superhero package. I want to talk a bit about magic and mind control and things like that. It seems like vampires are quite often depicted with some kind of magical or mystical ability.
Well, and I think we're almost looking at two things there. One, the ability for vampires to know and perform magic, I feel goes back to their roots of being linked to witches. So the fact that a vampire can be a sorcerer, may have started off as a sorcerer, actually going back to the folklore a little bit, one of the origins of how someone could be risen as a vampire is one to be buried in unhallowed ground, to be the victim of murder. But one of those stipulations was if a person is a sorcerer or magician or witch in life, when they die, if you're not careful, they will come back as a vampire. So I feel like the reason we see, especially, I feel like we see it a lot in fantasy, like in D&D, we see a lot of vampires as magic workers. So I feel like because of those roots with witches, we still see a lot of vampires doing magic.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you'll excuse me for a moment, I'm gonna go order some spell books so I can do some magic just in case I'll be able to come back as a vampire when I die. That's really something I'd like to happen.
I am 100% down for this plan. I want to commit some sort of heresy, some sort of witchcraft that will allow me to be the unquiet dead after I am buried.
Heresy, huh? Jesus looks like Ted Nugent. You think that'll do it?
I think that's just a fact.
I'll have to think on that.
Now, I will say flight and levitation is one of those powers that varies a lot. The issue of levitation and flight actually makes me think of Salem's Lot, which is, of course, for anyone not familiar, Stephen King's story where we see kind of the retelling of Dracula in a New England town, which is, of course, where he puts everything. And one of the things we see there is that how much the person can fly kind of depends. Like in the book, we actually see a lot less of vampires flying, although we do see even the lesser vampires in Salem's Lot being able to actually fly, whereas we see some like John Carpenter's vampires where the lesser vampires can't fly at all, but the masters can.
Yeah, and you know what? There is a power we did not put on this list. Shapeshifting.
Oh, absolutely. And that's a really cool thing to bring up because the shape shifting goes back, I mean, forever. It goes back to Dracula. Although, one thing that's worth mentioning is in Dracula, he did a little bit of shape shifting, but he did more animal control. There's actually a whole plot point where he steals a wolf from a zoo. And specifically, actually, the really cool thing about him stealing the wolf from the zoo is because they have all sorts of protections, like the garlic flowers, to keep him out, and he can't get in, but the wolf can. So he literally has the wolf jump through a window and tear down the flowers, allowing him to go in. So that's actually falls under, and we'll get into that a little bit more when we start talking about their weaknesses. But the shape shifting is interesting both into animals. So, of course, we see wolves, we see bats. Mist is a lot more common, especially in later interpretations where they can just turn into some kind of fog. Now, in I'm not going to even mention the movie yet, but in one of my favorite vampire movies, the vampire can actually shapeshift to look like any human he has met, and that's a very cool one. And do we want to talk about the Necroscope series here, or do we want to get to it later?
For a few reasons, I'm going to say let's look at that later. A, because there's a lot, and two, I haven't read it.
Well, we'll mention it briefly once we get down to depictions in books, but it needs to be mentioned if nothing else for the body horror, because anybody who's not familiar with the Necroscope series by Brian Lumley, it's just pure ass body horror.
It's also mentioned Brian Lumley passed in January of this year, and I haven't read his Necroscope series, but I've read a lot of his fiction, and he was a fantastic writer. Rest in peace and all that.
Oh, absolutely. I only read the Necroscope series because I was just sitting somewhere that it happened to be on a bookshelf, and I thought, man, this looks interesting. Gave it a try. It was a wild ride. I highly recommend it if you don't have need for trigger warnings. If there is any trigger that bothers you, maybe skip the Necroscope series. It's definitely actually the Necroscope series will be discussed whenever we do our episode on extreme horror.
Oh yeah, and that's I think going to be coming fairly soon because there's a few things I want to talk about in extreme horror too, especially some of the creepypasta authors that went on to write full novels, particularly Elias Witherow. I don't think he's written anything vampire related, so I'll just kind of mention that, but great writer, check him out.
Same thing. Whenever we do extreme horror, I've got to talk about Aaron Beauregard, who has become the splatterpunk author of TikTok, and so we're definitely going to have to talk about him too.
Absolutely.
Oh, I will throw in enhanced senses is the only one that we didn't that we kind of skipped over. And again, that's the ability to hear and see better. Often they're depicted as being able to smell blood from a really long way away or hear your heartbeat, that sort of thing. So we definitely see the enhanced senses a lot. And I think that's most of what we see again in sort of your generic vampires. As we get to specific instances that might have other powers, we'll cover those as we get to them.
Well, the great thing is, enhanced senses can also be used as a weakness. Speaking of weaknesses, so we have a long list of different weaknesses here. While not universal, it seems like each vampire has some kind of aversion to these things, at the very least.
Well, and I almost feel like that's a defining characteristic of a vampire. If a vampire quotation, doing my air quotes here, just has all the advantages and none of the disadvantages, it's not going to feel like a vampire. That's going to feel like a superhero. It's the weaknesses and the undead nature and all that that really makes it a true vampire.
And oftentimes they're considered to be evil or dark, but that's not always the case. We can get to that a little later, though.
Well, actually, just jumping right into mentioning the evil and dark nature and weaknesses brings us right to holy symbols. And I have a lot to say about vampires and holy symbols.
Absolutely. And there's a lot of interesting caveats and ideas behind why holy symbols might affect a vampire who's never heard of Christianity. But, typically the holy symbols involve the cross, they involve holy ground, they involve holy water. Which, fun fact, I'm actually, at one point in my life, I had an allergic reaction to holy water. I ever tell you this story?
No.
Way back when I was a young Catholic child, the priest, they would run around and sprinkle holy water everywhere. The priest there would scent the holy water, to give it a nice scent. And something they put in there did not work with me. So when they splashed me, I got a rash.
Is that when you began your journey to discovering that you were actually possessed by Pazuzu?
Not Pazuzu, Belphegor. We've been over this.
Much superior demon, in my opinion.
Absolutely. They're both good people, though. But yeah, no, holy water is not only something that hurts vampires, it hurts people who have allergies to certain scents. But water, in general, is also often a weakness of vampires, right?
Oh, absolutely. I actually want you to go ahead and give us the thing on Castlevania and their explanation with crosses and why they aren't necessarily the religious symbol that repels the vampires.
If you ever watch the Castlevania Netflix series, the first one, there's a scene where one of the characters finds a weapon that's shaped like a cross. And as she's looking at it, she seems confused because she comes from somewhere else where Christianity isn't a very common religion. And she says, well, how does this affect vampires who are from Africa, for example? I don't remember exactly what continent she said, but you get the idea. And Trevor Belmont explains it in a very loose way, but it's enough. He says, because they're predators, their eyesight works differently, and the cross throws them off. It throws off their eyes.
And I love that as an explanation. It's not too deep. It may not even hold up to like deep examination, but it's a hand wave. And I feel like it's the crosses affecting vampires is just something we're also okay with that give us a little hand wave and we're all good with it.
Exactly. And funny enough, I don't know if I told you this part of the story. Years and years and years and years and years ago, before the Castlevania was a cartoon, I was playing D&D in college, and some friends of mine were saying, you don't have Christianity in this universe. Why do crosses affect them? And I gave that exact explanation. I was so happy when it came up in that cartoon.
Now, I have two examples that I love of other systems and how they handle it. One is from the TTRPG, that's tabletop role playing game, kind of like Dungeons and Dragons. Vampire the Masquerade. And the way they handled holy symbols is that in general, holy symbols don't do anything. They just don't work. But occasionally you will see a vampire repelled by a holy symbol, and that's because certain characters can have a trait that it's actually treated as a literal mechanical trait called true faith. So that a human who has true faith can use holy symbols to repel vampires, but it's really more of the human themselves and their faith that does it, and not so much the symbol itself. Now, circling back to Salem's Lot, which I love Salem's Lot. I love the book. I actually liked the original movie and I adored the newest movie. We're going to be talking about that here in a little while. But in Salem's Lot, it's not the religious symbol so much that does it. It's closer to belief, but it's also an interaction with a deeper holy force called the White in Stephen King's universe. Because the White, he actually describes it in Salem's Lot as being an older force. It's this power that's behind all inherently good religions. So it's the White that possesses these, that makes the cross powerful, that makes the holy water powerful. It's also the same force that allowed a rabies shot or aspirin to keep someone from turning into a vampire because they believed in it. There's actually an entire like conversation about how aspirin is basically magic because no doctors understand how it works, and that's why it was able to do it. We actually see Father Callahan fighting or going to fight Barlow in Film's Lot, and he has a cross in his hand. And not only can it drive away Barlow, there's a locked door. He takes the glowing cross and just smashes the lock, and it melts before him because he's practically glowing with the energy of the White. So this is also kind of a cool interpretation of holy symbols and what powers them and how they work.
Yeah, and interestingly, segueing over to BBC, there was a three-part BBC Dracula movie. It was, well, it was about 2 hours per part. It was about 6 hours long. This isn't what's important. The first part was good, the rest of it was trash, but in the first part, when, someone shows him a cross, he kinda cringes away. He says, "Oh, that works, but not for the reason you think." And he explains it's because when he feeds on someone's blood, he takes on some very minute, subtle aspect of their personality. So if he just feeds on one person who has some crazy aspect of their personality, it's probably not going to be noticeable. But in the times when he was coming up as a vampire, a lot of people were Christian, i.e., God fearing. So he gained a fear of God through feeding on so many devout Christians.
That actually makes me think of another one, which is Dracula 2000, which is an interesting movie in that it's Dracula, just has the 2000s all over it. And one of the factors there is that Dracula himself is Judas from the Bible who betrayed Jesus. And they explain several different things, like the fact that he is vulnerable to silver is because of the silver he was paid to betray Jesus. So that's how they explain the silver and kind of connected it that way. So I'm a big fan when they take the, and of course, holy symbols being because they represent Jesus, who he is cursed for betraying. And I like when they find interesting ways to explain the holy symbols rather than just, yes, God is real and hates vampires.
You know, there's a somewhat, not exactly the same, but a somewhat similar idea in Dark Tower with Callahan as, you know what? The book came out, what, like
I
40 years
think we're
ago, right?
safe. I don't think we need to worry about spoilers for a 40-year-old book. I think we're good.
Okay, so as you know, Barlow in the book feeds Callahan his blood. In the movie, you know what? I won't give away what happens in the movie. That's newer. And the White basically rejects him. He loses his holiness. He can't go into the church. I don't remember quite how he got into the alternate reality of the Dark Tower, but the point is, there's a similar idea there where the holiness is somehow tainted by an outside force, betrayal. Kurt Barlow's disgusting blood. The description of it in the book is absolutely nasty, by the way.
So circling slightly back to our outline here, as we often need to do, because I want to talk some more about Salem's Lot and all that, but we'll get to that when we start talking true vampire, when we really get into discussing vampire movies. Another one that I really want to go over that I think is so interesting and often explained in slightly different ways is staking vampires.
Oh yeah, definitely. It's a pretty common one too,
I
isn't
want
it?
to say almost universal. I would say in some ways, staking vampires might even be one of the most universal. I can't now. It does different things. In some of them, it destroys them. You know, circling back to Dusk Till Dawn, staking them kills them. They just explode. It's one of the most efficient ways to kill them. But in most of them, it only paralyzes them. in, of course, Vampire the Masquerade, which I like referencing Vampire the Masquerade when talking powers and weaknesses because being a tabletop role playing game, the game being the operatable word here, they have very defined weaknesses and very defined powers. So it's kind of a handy one to reference. It's also meant to be an amalgamation of all of vampire fiction and kind of meant to feel they're meant to be the most vampire-y feeling vampires they could come up with. And same thing there, it doesn't kill them, it paralyzes them as soon as you pull out the stake, they come back.
Yeah, and we see actually, to come back to Legacy of Kain again, a similar idea. At the very beginning, Raziel says something like, vampires need only fear wounds that impale, inflame, or blah, blah, blah. The idea in that universe is that their souls are stagnating in their bodies and can't be reincarnated or, sent to whatever afterlife they might be in. So what happens is they get impaled and their souls go to the spectral realm, and Raziel, of course, eats their soul and they die permanently. They get put back into this wheel of fate. But the idea is, and in many other fictions, is that vampires are very durable, and any wound that they get is probably going to heal them. But unless something gets severed, chances are it's going to come back. And even if it gets severed, apparently it can be reattached because once again, Borodor shows up, recapitated, and nobody questions it. But we'll talk about that when we get to Legacy of Kain. I'm sorry.
Also, listeners want to call Hatter out just because I love his use of the word recapitated. I guarantee that's the first time you have heard that word this week.
I'm just saying, I'm surprised nobody has said that word before. It makes perfect sense.
Absolutely, but I'm still giving you credit for inventing it. Whenever we put it in the dictionary, you get a credit.
You hear that, folks? I coined a term today. What other weaknesses do vampires have? What are some of your favorites?
I will say that I think some of the mystical ones are really interesting and kind of callbacks. Actually, circling around this, and we're going to spiral to what I was going to say, is that some of these go back to the folklore, like the staking goes back to the idea was you would dig up the body and you would drive a stake through it, but it was less just trying to put a wooden piece through the heart. You were literally staking the vampire down so it couldn't get up. And I feel like there's a lot of things that have their roots in that, like garlic, wolf's bane. I mean, just a bunch of different herbs that are often known for being for having various different mystical or medicinal abilities that are used against vampires. Now, one thing I will say is that I love that most people's image of how garlic is used against vampires is based on them misunderstanding how garlic was used in Dracula, because one of the key plot points in Dracula is that Dr. Van Helsing, who we will be talking about some more for sure, is knowledgeable. And once he figures out that there's vampires, he brings these pretty flowers to adorn Lucy's room. And she looks at them and goes, "Oh, these flowers are so pretty." And then looks at them and goes, "Oh, wait a minute. This is just common garlic." So he actually isn't bringing like wreaths of garlic bulbs to hang in her room. They're garlic flowers. But when people heard wreath of garlic, they pictured those things people had in their pantries of garlic. So I think that's where the idea of using garlic bulbs, not using garlic, came from.
Oh, yeah, and there's some interesting ways you can explain garlic, but be it the bulb or the flower. For example, we can talk about enhanced senses again. Maybe the smell bothers them. I remember. Do you remember a show on Adult Swim called Lucy, the Daughter of the Devil?
No.
Well, it didn't exist for very long. But there's a part of that show wherein they talk about vampires because there are vampire choir boys. I don't know. It was a weird show. But they were saying, vampires aren't actually killed by garlic. They have a food allergy. If you want to give a vampire diarrhea, give them garlic.
Which is hilarious. I really like that take. Also, the idea that garlic and other things like that can be used to repel insects, and especially blood drinking insects, could be where some of the ideas about vampires being vulnerable or repelled by it. Also, the fact that it's antimicrobial, garlic was used in early poultices to keep wounds from festering. So I feel like kind of those associations might be where it came in, which coincidentally could be where silver came in, because silver was of course in modern day is more associated with werewolves than vampires, but still has associations with vampires, and it was often thought of as a pure metal. And one of the reasons why is silver does not interact with the body's immune system. So even as far back as like ancient Egypt, people knew that if you needed to, say, staple a wound closed, You couldn't use iron, you couldn't use copper, you could use silver.
Yeah, absolutely. And that also connects us to the idea that a vampire, you can't get a picture of them. They don't show up in mirrors. And recently, well, not really recently, but fairly recently, I read something somebody had said. I don't remember exactly where. They said vampires are, they don't like silver. And if you think about it, back in the day, any mirror was backed with silver, which includes, a wall mirror, mirrors in your camera. So that might explain why they don't show up.
I also want to say that at one point, the formula that they developed pictures in included silver. So that's yet another connection. And again, why they might not show up.
Which brings us to the question, would they show up on a digital camera? Why don't you tell us in the comments? What do you think?
Absolutely. Let us know, guys. Could a vampire be a Twitch streamer? I want to know.
Could a vampire have an Instagram account?
I actually now really want to write a story about a vampire who does still, for whatever reason, does not show up on a digital camera and so has to do their entire streaming career as a VTuber.
Oh, VTubers. You know what? That's a rant for another time, but that is hilarious. Yes. What would we call it? V is for VTuber.
You know what? I'm down. I this might be something we need to do at some point. Kind of
Absolutely.
circling back to the main list of weaknesses, I mean, we kind of have touched on certain types of damage killing vampires more easily, like burning, like dismemberment, like decapitation specifically. And again, I think most of that goes back to the original myths of vampires, where you had to get rid of them by taking care of their body, be it burning their body, be it decapitating their body, decapitating it and then burying the head at a crossroads, decapitating it, burning the head and burying the ashes at a crossroads, whatever. I feel like that's why those kind of forms of extreme damage kind of carry over. Also, just the idea that if something has powerful healing like a vampire, that something that also then does powerful damage, like, headshots, burning, fire, that kind of thing, it's going to make more sense for that to be the type of thing that would be needed to kill them.
Yeah, just the World War II attitude. Use as much overwhelming force as you can and you stop the enemy. Moving on from destruction to creation. What are vampires' origins?
And I feel like that's one of the really interesting things is because in every different vampire media, in every different vampire mythology, where vampires come from is really interesting. Like one of the first ones, of course, is the Dracula myth. And in Dracula, sometimes he is he is the first. Well, in a Dracula mythos, Dracula is always the first vampire. Sometimes he is cursed for blaspheming God. Sometimes, like in Dracula Untold, which is a very controversial show, but I have my own specific thoughts about it. But he specifically sought out some older vampire, so that's actually an example of Dracula not in a Dracula story, still not being the first vampire. In some things, he's an older thing, like again, we mentioned in Dracula 2000, where he was originally Judas. We have various different versions of Dracula is a previous cursed person from history. Probably by definition, would have to be the earliest version of that is in Vampire the Masquerade, where the very first vampire is Cain, the first murderer from the Genesis story from the Bible. So he is someone who is cursed, is kind of one of the very, very first versions of where do vampires come from that we get.
Absolutely. I really do like that idea in particular, the Cain Judas idea. I really like when, if Dracula's the first vampire, when they explain that, he's the Genesis, there weren't vampires before him. He's the very idea. And that's one thing I truly hated about Dracula Untold is the idea that he sees this elder vampire, and that's fine, but that doesn't tell us where vampires came from. That tells us how Dracula became a vampire. But okay, so where did this guy come from? Is there an ancient society before him? Tell us more about that, please.
Absolutely. And that's one of the things that I saw was one of the big weaknesses of that movie. Weirdly, I'm actually was here for the entire Dark Universe cinematic universe, which they were trying to create. Unfortunately, they just made several bad movies trying to make it. I'm all for horror villains being turned into superheroes. Don't get me wrong, I love horror movie people being horror movie people, But I'm okay if we want to just go ahead and make them superheroes too. I'm cool with that genre also being there.
Well, everyone's villain or monster is somebody's hero, right?
Well, and it's so, I mean, don't get me wrong, there was some stuff in Dracula Untold where it gave me all the good feels. I was rooting for him. I loved him getting to have that I loved getting to have that vampire power fantasy through the character of Dracula. So there were parts I liked, but then there were definitely some unsuccessful parts, like you say, kind of by making him not be the original vampire, you rob him of a lot of not only his interest as a character, but then you create a bunch of questions, like you said, where did vampires come from? Now I need an entire prequel.
Interestingly enough, though, there's a parallel between that and Legacy of Kain because we find out in Soul Reaver that most people think Kain is a god. They think he's always been that way. Very few people in the time when Soul Reaver starts know that Kain was human like everybody else once. And you could think that in Dracula Untold, that later on in his life, he kind of, pushed out that idea that, yup, I'm the first, I'm the god of vampires. So that's an interesting thought in itself. And if they had included that, I probably would have liked it a little more.
They very well may have thought about trying to do that later because they thought this was going to be the beginning of a series. So in Legacy of Kain, let us know what is the Hatter, what is the original origin of vampirism in this universe?
Well, vampires actually come from an ancient race. They never really give them a name. They just call them the ancients. And they're these winged beings. They're very powerful. They look angelic and they worship the elder god, this being that kind of pushes the circle of life and death, reincarnation. You find out later that he's actually not such a good god, but I don't want to spoil too much with the remasters coming out on the 10th and some people being new to it. But the idea was there was this other race called the Hilden. They were they were more humanoid than they are when they show up in the actual game, but they had this big war between them because the Hilden did not want to service the cycle of life and death. They didn't feel they had to die. And the vampires decided, okay, well, that's a dangerous idea. It kind of is. The vampires then cursed them and sent them to the demon realm and locked them down with the pillars. On their way out, the Hilden said, screw you guys, and put a curse on them. And that curse gave them bloodthirst. It gave them sterility, so they couldn't reproduce the normal way, and it made them immortal, so they couldn't serve the wheel of fate.
And I actually really like the idea of taking vampires as being kind of fallen gods who have cursed. I'm actually a huge fan of the all the vampire weaknesses are explained by different curses. I love that.
I love the fall from grace idea in general. The idea that these once great things are now seen as, the scourge of the land and so forth. And it actually wasn't always that way. Vampires were considered more of an annoyance for a while. The idea was that they were the guardians of the pillars when the pillars were erected, obviously, because they erected them to keep the Hilden in the demon realm. But the idea was because they're immortal and they're tied to the pillars, they would live forever and be able to continue keeping their pillar where it should be. And because of that, in case something should happen to them, they started turning people into vampires to overcome the sterility. So that I thought that was kind of interesting too.
Oh, absolutely. And kind of segueing from the demon thing of there being this demonic influence in their story, one of the things I think is really interesting to go back to Salem's Lot is that vampires in Stephen King's universe, not just Salem's Lot, but in the entirety of the Stephen King connected universe, that originally they come from these worm-like demons at the beginning of the universe, because in the Stephen King universe, everything began with something called the Prim, which is kind of the primordial chaos from which the entire universe flows. So you have these demons that once they were incarnated into the world, they kind of became the very first vampires, and then they influenced and created the older master vampires. So basically, in Stephen King's universe, vampires come from these ancient entities that are almost more Lovecraftian in nature. And mentioning Lovecraftian cosmic horror, that's going to be its own episode. So definitely stay tuned for that. We've got to talk cosmic horror and Lovecraft.
Oh, absolutely. That's one of my cosmic horror in general is one of my favorite subjects, but we can get more on that when we when we get to the episode. But yeah, demonic influence has been a has been a factor in vampire lore in a lot of different places. Like Dracula's name actually can translate to son of the dragon or son of the devil.
Absolutely. And I think one of the more underrated representations of Dracula is in the comic book Van Helsing that became the movie Van Helsing, where Van Helsing is kind of a more, well, superhero-y vampire monster hunter. And that Dracula literally just made a deal with the devil. That's how he got his power. He made a deal. He got given all these curses because he's now damned and evil. And a difference of his powers were given to him for different reasons. One of my favorite lines from that movie is when they're talking about Dracula was locked away on an island where no man could reach, where no ship could go. So the devil gave him wings, and that explains why he can turn into a giant demon bat. So I love the whole deal with the devil element of the Dracula story when that's used.
Yeah, and I love demonic, anything to do with demons, with hell, with any of that stuff. We're definitely going to have an episode on that and probably soon.
Absolutely, guys. Stay tuned for that. That's going to be a really fun episode. We've already kind of got it in the works.
Oh yeah, we're already working on it. But yeah, the idea of demonic influence in vampires, I love that personally for obvious reasons. But it connects back to the idea of holy symbols, of vampires being the enemy of God, not being able to go into the light. I think a lot of it comes from the fact that a lot of this was written at a time when Christianity had a stranglehold on literally everything ever. I don't mean last week, I mean it was even worse then. You see that influence in a lot of things. You see that influence in a lot of horror where it's something unholy, it's something from the devil and this and that, and, there are scarier things than the devil out there. I mean, have you ever listened to Taylor Swift?
Now, this is definitely going to be something that's going to get brought up more when we do our religious horror episode, but I'm going to do just a little taste of that today because I really want to bring it up since of what you mentioned. Is it is so fascinating to me to see how different religions are represented in different countries' media. Because in America, I cannot think of the last time that the church or Christianity was portrayed as a hero in a movie. I'm sure there was one, but I can't think of it. Almost exclusively, they're either impotent or downright malevolent. But I recently, not that recently, but recently watched Sweet Home, which is I want to say Korean. If I'm wrong, someone correct me, but I'm pretty sure it's Korean. Zombie kind of movie. But in it, we have one character who's essentially a samurai. He walks around with a katana. He's very skilled and he's saving everyone's life. But one of his whole things is that he is very Christian. He is very devout. But that's depicted as like making him, as showing that he's a really good person. Because this is a really exotic, interesting religion that someone could be. There's not that many Christians in Korea. They're not unheard of, but they're like a cool niche thing that they added to his character to make him more interesting. And he's very selfless, very caring, and that's how they view that religion. Whereas, like, whenever I was watching Blue Exorcist, which is set in Japan, the religion that they really downed on was Shinto. Their Shinto priestess was seen as a drunk and a cheat and selfish. So it's a little bit of a prophet has no honor in his own country kind of thing. We look down on Christianity in America in horror, and they're often seen as the bad guys because we have so much Christianity here. But in other countries where it's more an exotic flavor, it sometimes gets depicted better.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, to bring up another example of that, we've all, you know what? I'm not going to go on a tangent about Has Been Hotel, but that's kind of the whole idea there.
Absolutely. So let's circle back around to the outline and get back on vampires, having wandered away into religious horror, which again is coming soon as a very cool episode.
Very soon. But yeah, no, we were talking about how demonic influence is often a reason for vampires to be the way they are. And yeah, and what that comes from is just that, for so long, it was the main thing in our country. It was just something you just were. For anybody outside of our country, we live in the US. You just were a good, God fearing, red blooded American and this and that. Same thing in England, of course, way back in the day. And I think that the reason that it's often depicted as impotent and so forth, and this is going into the territory of the next episode, but I'll be real quick about it, is because of that. It makes a lot of people feel safe, and it's the same idea of analog horror and creepypasta. People feel safe in it. When it's not safe, it's scary.
Absolutely. And I love that interpretation where it's being shown as not effective because it's was seen as something that should be effective, and when you take that away, suddenly you feel vulnerable. Now, one thing I want to jump into kind of as our last little section of vampire biology, as it were, before we get into really discussing media and how vampires in media and their strengths and weaknesses interact and all that, I want to talk about the different kinds of vampire bites. because how a vampire bites you is a weirdly varied and important element of vampirism.
Absolutely. I have a list of bite types here. We can go over them one by one, or I can go over the list first.
Oh, let's kind of just cover the list shotgun approach and then we'll address them individually.
Okay, so we have a few types of bites here. We have the standard two fangs in, suck the blood. We have the vicious bite. We have dusk till dawn, which we'll get to when we get to it, but it's very interesting. There are sometimes fangs in the vagina, and there are love bites, as we put it.
Well, and kind of starting at the bottom and working our way back up, the love bites, which is our fun little way of saying the bite that feels really, really good if you get given it. I'm not going to say it was started by Anne Rice, but it was definitely popularized by Anne Rice. And just to be perfectly blunt, we're talking about orgasmic bites. The vampire bites you, and you have a very, very good time. And that was kind of very much started by her. You see it, of course, a lot in the paranormal romance that it features vampires now. But I feel like it's present in a lot of vampire media now. It's even present in Vampire the Masquerade, role playing game. So the vampire bite that feels suspiciously good is really, really common, almost ubiquitous. And I think that goes back to Anne Rice.
Oh yeah, and vampires and sexuality have been a thing for a very long time. I mean, they made Dracula a very charming individual in those old movies. To put it the best way I can. And we see it throughout history, the idea of vampires being some kind of taboo attractive thing, and there's just the inherent symbolism of the bite, penetration and exchange of fluids and this and that. So there's almost always some degree of sexuality when it comes to vampires.
And just to sort of touch on, because you have to feel like you at least have to mention it, as you said, sometimes the fangs are in someone's vagina. And like that's even touched on and mentioned in the Blade movies. We see it in other stuff where it's a little more prevalent. This is also more prevalent in non-European vampires. And that actually, now interestingly, we're not going to go deeply into it here, but that actually ties into the whole vagina dentata horror trope and folklore trope, which there was a movie called Teeth that featured that. Wasn't vampirism, but did involve, well, vagina dentata. It kind of ties into the whole vagina dentata mythology, which we may discuss at some point because Teeth is a weirdly really good movie. But just sort of like I said, touching on the fact that that does exist.
I also need to point out that when you started talking about this, you said we're not going to go very deep into this, and I have to say that's what she said. But yeah, moving up the list, Dusk Till Dawn, theirs was in my opinion one of the most interesting methods of bite. Do you remember it?
I do. Let us kind of lead us on that. What is the dusk till dawn method of vampire feeding?
Well, if you look at a vampire, especially in the series, you see, well, he's played by the guy who played Fez. I don't remember the guy's name. But the first time you see him feed, he's talking about flavors and stuff. And when he goes to bite the guy, he opens his mouth and his fangs kind of shoot out like the way a viper's might. They're kind of similar to snakes. And he doesn't drink the blood through his mouth. He pulls it in through his teeth, which I thought was really interesting, straight to the bloodstream.
Well, and I love that idea because often, like the Bela Lugosi vampires, were depicted as leaving two small wounds, which implied they had hollow fangs that they were sucking them out through, or sucking the blood out through. And I feel like that's more that if a vampire was going to have hollow fangs, the hypodermic needle style fangs of a pit viper kind of make more sense for that. And of course, in Dust Till Dawn, vampires are related to snakes because they are kind of descended from Aztec snake demons. We see the whole, at the end of the first movie, we see the whole Aztec pyramid underground under the bar. So that's a wonderful tie-in for them and a way for them to explain the how vampires drink blood thing, specifically using their lore.
Yeah, personally, I like the hypodermic fangs, but another take on Dracula explained it a little bit differently. Do you remember the Grim Adventures of Billy and Mandy?
Sort of do. I didn't watch this particular episode that much. I'm going to let you take the lead on this because this is hilarious. Please tell them about the Dracula from Bill and Mandy.
So the Dracula from the Grim Adventures of Billy and Mandy is played by the great Phil Lamar. And he's absolutely hilarious, first of all. But when he describes to Grim, after Grim is bit by or stung by a scorpion, and he says, suck the venom out, Dracula says, I told you, Dracula don't suck. He scrape with his fangs, then lick up the blood, like this. Scrape and lick. And I just wanted to bring that up because I love Phil Lamar. I love the Grim Adventures of Billy and Mandy, and I love his take on Dracula.
And that is something we're going to put a pin in and discuss how vampires play into horror comedy so perfectly. Some of my favorite horror comedies of all time involve vampires, and that is a wonderful moment of comedy. That's even kind of horror comedy because the Grim Adventures of Bill and Mandy were kind of like almost like, you know, baby's first horror comedy kind of vibe, which I love.
Absolutely. It's one of my favorite shows ever. And there's a lot of great horror comedy out there. Of course, we need to passively mention Dracula Dead and Loving It because Mel Brooks is perfect and he's never allowed to die.
Actually, I want to hold off on Dracula Dead and Loving It because I want to wait till we get to the movies. Before we get to the movies, we've got to talk about vampires in books and literature.
Oh yeah, and that's a crazy rich history, but here as you can see, I've split it up into historic literature and more modern literature because it's very different.
Absolutely. Um, because I know that you recently read it for the first time, I want you to tell everyone about your experience with the very first vampire novel ever.
All right. Well, first, folks who are listening, let us know down in the comments. What do you think was the first vampire story ever? Novel, short story, what have you? I bet a lot of you said Dracula. It's not Dracula. It's a story by John Polidori called Vampire, spelled with a Y. Maybe it's pronounced vampire. I'm not sure. And interestingly, I think actually, Gray, you probably want to tell this part because you seem pretty excited about it.
Absolutely. The story of the book Vampire by Polidori, it's far more interesting for how it came to be than for what it is. I'll let Hatter in a second talk about his experience reading it, but here's how it came to be. There were a bunch of bored, gothy writers sitting around discussing what would make a good scary story and challenged each other to write scary stories. The result of one of those writers writing her scary story is one you're probably very familiar with because it was Mary Shelley and she wrote Frankenstein. Well, at the same time, you had these people sitting around, her, Lord Byron, her husband, sitting around. Well, also with them was Lord Byron's doctor, who was Polidori. And he wrote Vampire, which at the same time was literally him writing the first vampire novel, was also him making fun of his boss. Because the character that he wrote as the bad guy, as the vampire, was just Lord Byron made up to be funny and kind of to be sort of insulting. So we actually have right there kind of the birth of the vampire and the birth of Frankenstein happening at the same time, which, as Matt's about to tell you, is probably the most interesting thing about this book.
Absolutely. Little side note, another fun fact: Lord Byron also shows up in the Grim Adventures of Billy and Mandy as a ghost that's haunting Billy. But anyway, back on subject. Yeah, vampire. Its origin is the most interesting thing about it, as Gray said. It was one of the most boring things I've ever read in my life. Not even gonna lie. Not gonna sugarcoat it. And it gets points. It gets points for being the first idea and kind of somewhat inventing the idea of the modern vampire. But the whole story, it's a short story, thank God. The whole story just goes kind of like this. This guy, he's out on whatever they call it. This guy, he's going out into the world to experience the world. He's coming of age and all that stuff. He meets a girl, he likes the girl, and he hears the story about the vampire. All of her people tell him, stay away, don't talk about the vampire. It's a real thing. He ends up being haunted by this guy. This girl that he loves is taken by the vampire. And finally, when he goes home to see his sister turns out is marrying somebody, and guess who it is?
I'm going to take a wild guess and say it's the vampire.
It's the vampire. And while that's an interesting twist, it's like the whole story was just this guy being haunted by this vampire, and it's just kind of basic. And again, it set out a good blueprint, but the story itself is very dry. And I'm somebody who reads a lot of classic literature and a lot of gothic literature, so I'm used to that tone and everything. Believe me, it's not just me. The story was boring.
Well, and I think it's worth mentioning because whenever you say that this book written so long ago was boring or dry, I think a lot of people are going to go, oh, well, yeah, but all stories back then were boring or dry. And that is absolutely not true because that leads us into kind of the next big vampire book. And again, I think people are going to say, oh, he's going to talk about Dracula now. No, we're still not to Dracula yet because before Dracula, after Vampire, there was Carmilla. And I read Carmilla a while back, and I've got to say, Carmilla is not dry. Carmilla is not boring. Even to a modern audience reading it, it's still a pretty fun read. If you told me that this was kind of a historical drama where they meant for it, where it was someone writing it today, but setting it in that era, I'd probably believe you. It's a pretty well written story. And as we talk about Carmilla, there's two cool factors we have to talk about Carmilla. One is the kind of functioning and biology of Carmilla as a vampire because she was more like an older traditional vampire that's more like a ghost. Because during the day, she slept in her coffin, but the coffin was still in the ground. She could literally walk through solid earth, she could walk through solid walls. She was more like a spirit in that sense. She was immaterial. She didn't have to walk through a door into a building where she kept her coffin. She just ghosted right back into her coffin during the day. The other factor that I think is very worth mentioning is that this is one of the earliest out and out representations of lesbianism in a main popular book that existed. Because while the main character, the young girl that is kind of our heroine in Carmilla, she is not a lesbian. She is a young innocent girl who isn't even familiar with this concept. Carmilla absolutely is. Well, we at least know that she likes girls. Whether she likes guys or not is never explored in the book. There's this actually really funny, and when I say it's not boring, it actually has good humor in it because there's lots of elements of Carmilla, the vampire, which of course they don't know is a vampire at this point, coming on to this girl, trying to hold her, hug her, even trying to kiss her. And the girl's like, oh, I must remind her of someone in her family. She's so affectionate. Even when it makes her uncomfortable, she's kind of like, oh, maybe she comes from a really affectionate family. And then everyone around her, bear in mind, they all totally get what's going on, and they're like, "Oh man, who should tell her? Are you going to tell her? I'm not going to tell her. Should we tell her?" So it's totally the fact that she's just oblivious. Everyone else gets that Carmilla is trying to come on to this girl. So Carmilla, which was the kind of the second vampire book, if you want to look at it that way, is weirdly still really good.
I also feel we should mention because I did get to read a bit of it. As you know, I wanted to read it before the episode, but I couldn't really find the time to read a whole novel over the course of a week. Yeah, it's written by a man, and surprisingly, the female characters feel real and natural.
Which is so cool, and I love it when we see that because I feel like there's the stereotype of, oh, men can't write women and women can't write men, and it's more good writers can write anybody. So this guy, I think this guy gets massive points not only for being a man who can write good, believable, really cool female characters, but being a man from the 1800s who can do that. Dude needs all the props in the world.
Absolutely. We talked at length about this concept and I don't want to go off onto a tangent about that, but we see a lot that oftentimes a man can't write a woman can't write a man, women can't write women, men can't write men. Nobody can write anybody in a realistic way. And just what the heck's going on? Like if you have a question about something, ask somebody. Like if you're a man writing a female character, ask somebody. You'll find a female person and ask them.
I'm 100% of the opinion that some of these writers, be they men or women, have never actually spoken to a member of the opposite sex, and that's where some of the problem comes from.
And that's why I say if you're somebody, let's say you're a man writing a female character and you want them to sound real, you can avoid any kind of awkwardness by saying I'm writing a book, don't think I'm weird, and ask some questions.
Speaking as a writer, often having to preface any weird thing you say or do by, look, I'm writing a book. That's just a part of life. You have to get comfortable with that being a writer.
Exactly. But
So, of course, now having covered Carmilla, which is, like I said, weirdly fantastic, we are going right into Dracula, which is the main event everyone's been waiting for.
the granddaddy of them all.
And there's so many interesting qualities about Dracula. We're just going to touch on some of them about the novel because we could do an entire episode on Dracula, and for all I know, we will at some point.
Almost definitely.
But it's essentially the found footage of the time, which we talked a little bit about in our found footage discussion, because it's all written as diary entries and things like that. Um, it introduces the vampire hunter characters, which is Van Helsing, who we see shown ever after. He's depicted very differently in Dracula than I think most people picture him, because he's actually very caring, very grandfatherly, very cool, but also very knowledgeable, very open minded. I also want to take a minute to talk about the three suitors of Lucy. These are the three guys who were all three competing for her hand. And they are some of the coolest male. We talked about in Carmilla, we get to see some really cool, realistically written women. In Dracula, we get to see some of the best written non toxic masculinity I've ever seen. These guys are cool, they're manly, but at the same time, they're affectionate. All three of them are friends. And even though they were competing for the same girl, they love each other, they care for each other, they support each other. And even after she picks one of them, they all care about her and want to take care of her and fight to protect her. And of course, the three guys we are talking about is Dr. Stewart, who is the doctor in charge of an asylum. There is Quincy, who is a Texan, who is a son of a cattle baron. As which is so cool to have a Victorian England setting with a Texan with a Bowie knife in it. I really love that. Being a Texan myself, I love Quincy. And then there is Arthur, who is kind of the rich kid. He's the Lord, but he's depicted as this very nice guy. Yeah, he's wealthy, but he's also just really caring. And of course, he's the one she picks. And these three monster hunters, who then team up with Van Helsing, who is a good friend of Dr. Stewart, they kind of formed that beginning of the concept of vampire hunters and what a team of vampire hunters should look like. And in some ways, I think they're still the best one that's ever been depicted.
I definitely agree with that. Now, my opinion on Dracula is I hate to say I never really loved the book. I loved some of the ideas, like the things you're mentioning, I really liked. The style of it really wasn't for me. But it's a great story, obviously. It's been redone 575,000 times, so it must have something to it, right?
Oh, absolutely. And the thing with the book is it kind of depends on where you're coming at it from. Like parts of the book I adore and I think are well written. I think hold up till today. But then there are definitely parts that slump. I do think the whole found footage element of it works against it sometimes because we spend entirely too much time on certain boring segments when we really need to get to the monkey. Just for your edification, we may not even leave this in, and hell, we may leave this in. So, listeners, you may or may not be hearing this. Get to the Monkey is a song by Flight of the Conchords talking about what was wrong with the movie King Kong and talking about how it was a great movie. Jack Black is really funny, talking about that King Kong, but that it takes a really long time before we ever see King Kong. And the chorus of the song is, get to the fucking monkey. Just get to the fucking monkey. We've been here so long and we haven't seen Kong. Just get to the fucking monkey. And that's why a short term for me, for any time a movie or book just needs to get to the point, I say it needs to get to the fucking monkey.
I agree. That's how I felt about Dracula. But I was saying Dracula inspired a lot of later media and especially a lot of characters. Dracula not only inspired a lot of what in popular culture would be the weaknesses for vampires, just his character itself inspired a lot of characters. I call these characters Draculian.
Which is also a word that Hatter is going to get credit for in the dictionary for inventing.
I've coined two terms tonight. But I have a small list, and I think I should start just explaining what the characteristics of a Draculian character are.
Absolutely.
And obviously, it means they're Dracula like. They're similar to Dracula. But what are these characteristics? They tend to be kind of charming and suave. And, you see them, they're bad, but you kind of think they're likable at the same time. Usually, they have some kind of mystical abilities about them or seem like they do. And despite the fact that they are, in fact, a wolf in sheep's clothing, you can see the teeth through the costume.
For sure. And a couple of ones that we talked about a little bit is like the Man in Black, or which is sometimes known as Randall Flagg, sometimes has other names from Stephen King's universe. And he very much has some Draculian elements to him, including one of them being that he wears black. While that is not necessarily a huge thing that it has to be inspired by Dracula, I feel like that's become almost a shorthand. If I have a character and I want you to think of him as maybe being just a little bit like Dracula, if I dress him all in black, that at least gets you pointed in the right direction.
Oh yeah, and he definitely also has the kind of charm. He's ageless. He has a strong connection to magic, and he's always got an evil plan up his sleeve. I think, of course, Matthew McConaughey. Well, he was the only one who. No, never mind. That's not true actually, because he was also in the Stand movie. But I'm gonna say on that one. I didn't think he was so great. Matthew McConaughey did a great job playing him. And another fun fact about him, he is Nyarlathotep. I don't mean he was based on Nyarlathotep. I mean in the Stephen King universe, he is literally Nyarlathotep.
Which anybody who's not familiar with who Nyarlathotep or Nyarlathotep, pronunciation is weird in Lovecraft. He is a character from Lovecraft's mythos that is kind of the most human of all his evil cosmic horror entities. He is a reincarnated, well, not a reincarnated, he is an Egyptian dude slash evil entity that has just been around a really long time and is still around in the modern era. So actually, I hadn't thought of that. This wasn't on the list, but Nyarlathotep himself could probably be thought of as a Draculian character.
Oh yeah, he definitely has the charm about him. He's been around for a long time. He can shapeshift. That's he's the god of a thousand faces.
So absolutely, that's another character for there.
I'm glad I went on that segue. Now I know the next one on the list is one you want to talk about, so I'll let you.
Absolutely. One of the next ones is Hannibal Lecter. Now, less in Silence of the Lambs and more in the movie Hannibal, because the movie Hannibal is actually one of my favorites, but a lot of people who loved Red Dragon, who loved Manhunter, which was the other Red Dragon, and who loved those kind of psychological serial killer focused stories, they kind of didn't like Hannibal as much because Hannibal was a bit of a genre shift. And Hannibal shifted more to like a creature horror because it really focused more on kind of how inhuman Hannibal was. Because, of course, in the books, Hannibal has violet eyes, Hannibal has six fingers. We talked about this a little bit in our last podcast, just briefly. But the fact that he's much more like a monster in Hannibal, and including they even very intentionally draw connections between him and Dracula. In the Dracula novel, whenever Dracula writes a letter, of course he signs it Dracula, but then whenever he writes the postscript, he signs it with the initial D. When Hannibal does exactly the same thing in the movie Hannibal, he does the same thing and signs his postscript with an H, very much making it feel Dracula-esque. So where he kind of is depicted as this Draculean supernatural creature, I feel like we really get that feel from Hannibal, at least in that one movie.
Absolutely, and I'm on the same page with you as you on this one. I thought Hannibal was better. I like the series actually a lot better than I liked any of the movies, but that's for another discussion.
Oh, for sure.
But beyond Hannibal, the last one I have listed here is one. I guess a lot of people don't really think of him as Draculian, but just follow me on this. The lead Cenobite in Hellraiser. I'm gonna be respectful and call him by his actual name. Neither he nor Clive Barker like when people call him Pinhead. When he shows up, just like Dracula, he has that charm. He has that idea that you don't know if he's good or bad. And in reality, and this is why the third movie and after ruined it, he's neither. He's just a force of nature, and he's not there to torture people because he wants to quote unquote hurt them. He's there to do it because to him that's the greatest thing ever. He's like, "Oh yeah, torture's great. Love it." And he's been around forever and he was once human in the movies. That's not the case in the books, but especially the movie version of Pinhead is Draculian for that reason. Like I said, he was human once and something came into his life and made him something else.
Oh, and that's a character we have to talk about more. That's going to have to be its own episode because I really love the character. Of course, like you mentioned, uh, in a lot of the fans and people call him Pinhead. A lot of fans call him Pinhead. In the original movie, I think he's credited as lead Cenobite. I know in later movies he's credited as Hell Priest. And one of the things that to me makes him so Draculian, again, is of course his outfit. He's all black, looks super suave, super sharp. Love that. Love the look they have for him. But it's the attitude he has. He's also the most like honorable of the Cenobites. Like in one of the books, a girl who is not mentally well, but who really likes to do puzzles, does the little puzzle box and summons the Cenobites. The other Cenobites are getting ready to take her, and Hellpriest stops them and says, "No, we are not summoned by hands." And the idea that they are summoned by desire, and he goes after the person who put the girl up to it. So he's such a cool character, such a suave character, and I think it's that energy that makes him Draculian.
Oh, absolutely. And another thing I want to actually mention about that is if you remember when Kirsty solves it, he's ready to take her, and that kind of gives me this idea that maybe somewhere deep down she's kind of interested in what he has to offer. But that's for another episode. And yeah, I want to just actually go a bit on the story about the Hell Priest thing. Initially, where that name came up was actually in the book The Scarlet Gospels, which Clive Barker was teasing that for a very long time as a follow up to The Hellbound Heart, which is what the book that Hellraiser was based on. And for a long time, he's teasing this. He's like, Pinhead's finally going to get a real name. And I remember when I read it and the name came up, my face was in this big smile. I was so excited. It comes up and it says, The Hell Priest. And my face just immediately dropped to the floor. I'm like, really, Clive?
So, circling back to the core outline, I want to talk about how vampires kind of inspired a lot of other horror, and specifically, there's a really interesting divergence where one depiction of vampires led to the entire zombie genre. So, there was actually a point at which zombies and vampires kind of shared a common ancestor and then split off. And I feel like the point of this divergence, or at least the beginning of them being melded together, was the book I Am Legend, which got turned into movies several times. At one point, it was Last Man on Earth, the Omega Man, and then later to a movie that was actually called I Am Legend, and was also one of the ones that was the least like the actual book itself, which is really kind of sad and funny because the author of the book hates all the interpretations of the movie.
Alan Moore over here.
Absolutely. And in that, we have vampires. He calls them vampires, but in reality, they're more what we classically now think of as a zombie. But at the time, the classic idea of a zombie, because you got to keep in mind, this was pre Romero, this was before Night of the Living Dead. We didn't have that concept of a zombie at that time. So these vampires became the inspiration for Romero to make his zombies. So this is actually the part where vampires themselves inspired the zombie genre.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a split off there because in the original book, they were kind of just slow, shambling, and they were a plague that basically took over the whole world. The whole idea is our main character was out there, killing them and hunting them. And the whole idea, well, the idea at the end of the day was they were the new life on Earth. They were the next major life on Earth. So to them, these people just living their lives, he was the monster. He was the thing out there hunting and killing them. That was probably the best part of the whole book, in my opinion.
Which is so interesting because that element of that story then gets reused in other zombie narratives later on. Like, I don't know if you've ever read or watched The Girl with All the Gifts, but it ends up in a similar place. We're not really doing zombies, so I'll hold off on this. Although, rest assured, listeners, we are going to be doing zombies. Zombies is one of my favorite tropes, one of my favorite genres, and we're going to get to zombies.
100%. And there's a similar idea. I kind of feel like the book Cell was also based around this idea by Stephen King. A lot of people didn't like it, but I like that book.
I have a very complicated relationship with that, and we will get to that in the zombie episode. So, my wife was just telling me there's going to be an I Am Legend 2 where they're going to be retconning back to the original ending from the book, changing the ending that they had in the Will Smith movie and trying to hopefully get closer to a book, but actually bouncing off the Will Smith movie. We're going to have to see how that goes. That sounds very dodgy, but there's at least some hope in it.
I'm definitely, at the very least, I'm morbidly curious about it.
For sure. So that kind of carries us into modern literature with
We're
vampires.
gonna have to talk about the book I shall not name, aren't we?
Yes, we are absolutely going to have to talk about the book that is your nemesis and the blight upon your soul. And of course, listeners, we are talking about Twilight.
Why don't you read out loud what I notated here about Twilight?
I will for the listeners to let you know as I am reading from our outline. It says Twilight sucks. Ruined vampires for years. Fuck these books. Fuck them to hell. So now what I want to ask you, Hatter, is please tell us what you really think about these books.
Well, I thought, yeah, they were okay. I'm totally kidding. Is the one of the worst things I ever read. The book was recommended to me by somebody I knew in high school because they knew I liked vampires. So I, knowing nothing about them, looked at the cover. I'm like, it kind of looks like a soap opera, but I'll start reading. And as I got into this book, I'm like, okay, the grammar is, and I'm not a grammar cop, but I was like, this grammar doesn't make any sense. These are the most boring characters I've ever read. This is the most boring writing style I've ever read. These are not vampires. I wish to burn this book, but it belongs to the library, so I'll just have to return it.
one thing I'm gonna have to agree with is that Twilight did ruin vampires for years. But what we say specifically is not that it ruined them, it de-gothified them. Basically, the type of people who used to really like vampires were the kind of counterculture, kind of niche people, and Twilight brought them into the main culture. Every teenage girl loved vampires after Twilight, and thus being the counterculture type people that we were, because I was of course the gothy kid, you couldn't like it if it was mainstream. So every goth fell out of love with vampires for a while until eventually the books and movies faded into obscurity and we were allowed to like them again.
I hope we didn't bring them back out of obscurity by mentioning them.
I don't think our audience is quite big enough that if Twilight gets a resurgence that it can be blamed on us. So I think we're okay so far.
Good, good. Some things best remain buried. But there was like something you mentioned though, because again, I didn't get very far into the books, but something to do with Mormonism.
Yes. Now, as I'm sure that is not a surprise to anyone, is the author of the Twilight novels is a Mormon. Now, I have a lot of Mormon friends, and one of the really interesting things about Mormons is they are very different than kind of standard Protestant Christianity and kind of have their own folklore. And one of the things that I find so interesting about the vampires in Twilight is how little they resemble other vampires. About the only thing they have in common is they drink blood. Other than that, they're really not much like other vampires. They sparkle in the sunlight, so they don't really have that element. There's definitely no element of unholiness or even really undeadness to them, although they were humans. But that's because, in my opinion, I do not think they were based off of vampires. She just called them vampires because that made them popular. They are based off Mormon angels because Mormons believe angels have some really interesting qualities. Mormons believe that angels used to be humans who were dead and have come back. They believe there's other kinds, but that's the kind that's relevant for this discussion. So this is a human who died and has come back, and they believe these angels would be sent to interact with people and that they would have certain weird characteristics that marked them as a human. They would look sort of inhuman. There's a whole weird thing about how they shake hands and whether they can or cannot shake your left or right hand. Um, so there's this entire weird element of folklore around Mormon angels, and I think that was the author's inspiration and why her vampires look so weird compared to standard vampires.
Yeah, and probably and the more separation we get between vampires and what happened in Twilight, the better. So I like this idea.
Now, one thing that I will say that is kind of funny because probably a little bit before, but also around the same time, there was a series of books called Anita Blake Vampire Hunter about a female vampire hunter. And overall, they're pretty good. I think she gets a little bit. The author gets her wires crossed and kind of wanders off and loses the plot and starts trying to work through her own weird guilt later in the books. But they start off very good and they were a little bit popular at the same time that Twilight was. And so one of my favorite memories is being at a mall where they had a bookstore that had a launch party for one of the Twilight novels. And of course, you had people who were wearing Team Jacob t shirts and other people who were wearing Team Edward t shirts. And there was one person sitting there wearing a Team Anita t shirt. And of course, referencing Anita Blake, Vampire Hunter. Now, I to this day do not know if they meant they wanted to see Bella get into a romantic relationship with Anita Blake, Vampire Hunter, or she just wanted to see Anita Blake, Vampire Hunter, kill the entire cast of Twilight. Either way, I'm kind of down.
I like the second one better. But yeah, okay. So we can move past Twilight now because, I don't want to think about it anymore. But what do I have next on? I have Salem's Lot on the list next here, which is interesting because it's also, and I know we talked about it a minute ago, but it's also kind of a modern retelling of the Draculian vampire.
Absolutely. Barlow, who is a really cool vampire. Now, he looks a lot more like what in modern times we picture as a Nosferatu looking vampire. He's bald, has the ears, big snaggletooth. Actually, one of the interesting things in Salem's Lot is that he can't talk. He has the giant mouth full of fangs. He can't form words. So when he communicates with people, he does it telepathically. So I feel like I'm not going to say unique, but it's definitely a feature of vampires I haven't seen very often. So I think it's a creative way for Stephen King to take that.
It's definitely an idea of evolution. As they change, they develop new. sort of adaptations, which we're going to talk a lot about when we get to Legacy of Kain. So I'll just leave it there for now.
For sure. And of course, anybody who hasn't seen Salem's Lot or read Salem's Lot or whatever, usually a giant part of it is we just spend a whole lot of time with this New England town. I sometimes joke about it being town porn, where he's just gratuitously demonstrating life in New England for us, which works for some people, doesn't work for some people. For me, it's kind of a midway thing. I more enjoy Stephen King in spite of that, not because of that.
Well, for some people, it's the main event.
But bump. Ting.
We have Anne Rice on the list, who we have spoken a bit about. I think you'd have more to say about her than I would because honestly, I haven't read her books. I did love her books and her movies, but it's been a while.
Anne Rice is someone that I really don't feel like you can talk about vampires without talking about Anne Rice, because I feel like in a lot of ways they really her vampires really set the tone for certain modern vampires. For one, I feel like without her you don't have the huge influx of paranormal romance featuring vampires. She's really if not the genesis, she's the driving force behind that. Now, her book, Interview with the Vampire, which was a very iconic movie, also, I loved it when I was a gothy teenager. It really spoke to me. I do feel like she took something different than I took from it, though, because she wrote the book and she liked Lestat. Lestat is the character that she took off and had go on all these adventures. I identified with Louis. I liked him a lot better. So I actually would have much rather read more books about Louis than more books about Lestat. I thought Lestat was kind of a whiny bitch, and that's compared to Louis, who was like by definition a whiny bitch. So so I feel like she was kind of responsible for bringing the sexy vampire into the modern realm with modern sexiness, not just the older suave Draculian kind of character.
Absolutely, and a lot of it was back in the day, the older suave one. It was more implicit. Where with her, she made it a little more explicit. Not explicit as in inappropriate, but out there, more obvious.
Yeah, the sexuality was more like intentionally being brought up. Now, my wife did just tell me that in the thing of discussing sexy vampires, I must bring up Barnabas Collins from Dark Shadows. And the interesting that he's definitely Draculian. I mean, he's a straight up, he is meant to look like and sound like Dracula. And Dark Shadows, of course, for anyone who's not familiar, was literally a soap opera that happened to have supernatural elements. It had vampires and werewolves and witches. And for a show from the time, I thought it was quite good. I used to watch it with my dad. And Barnabas Collins is sort of worth mentioning because I don't know if listeners, if you're familiar with who Mr. Bean is, the British comedian, but the actor who played Barnabas Collins looked just like Mr. Bean. He's a goofy looking British dude with giant ears. But that being said, even as goofy looking as he was so cultured, so suave, so elegant, he still managed to be sexy.
I always like when it's more unconventional. Like it's more about the character than their physical appearance.
Which is absolutely the opposite of what they did in Interview with a Vampire, which is just find the most conventionally attractive dudes you can, put them in long hair, and give them vampire makeup.
Yeah, pretty much, pretty much. But what do we have next? Southern Vampire Mysteries. This is something that you again know a little more about than I do.
Southern Vampire Mysteries was the name of the book. You're probably more familiar with it as True Blood, the TV series. And in all honesty, it's pretty good. It's not my favorite, but I do think some of the characters are pretty interesting. I feel like our main character, Suki Stackhouse, was like trying to be a really interesting, strong female character, and she was and wasn't, kind of depending on the time of day. So it definitely had some interesting stuff. I like that it's set in the South, being a Southerner myself. I do feel like a lot of the Southern stuff they depicted well. Of course, like most series, over time, it jumped the shark and they started adding too many elements that were too out there. But I feel like they had some good characters, they had some fun stuff in there, and it was huge during its time. It was also one of the definitely not the first, but it was one of the earlier vampire movies or vampire series to take advantage of the HBO Showtime element of being able to actually show nudity. You mentioned Anne Rice making the sexuality more explicit. I would say they took the sexuality and made it explicit to that. I mean, we literally see nudity in this series, which I'm not, again, this was definitely not the first vampire fiction to do that, but I feel like it kind of jump started a lot of vampire fiction doing it.
Oh yeah, 100%. I didn't watch much of True Blood. I saw a couple of episodes. I was like, okay, it's better than Twilight, but I have to say, once even though didn't really get into it.
Oh, absolutely. And even I watched quite a bit of it, and even my takeaway was it's okay. It's a show. You could watch it, kind of thing. It exists.
So on that note, film and TV has changed a lot over the years as well when it comes to vampires. We've seen more comedy, we've seen less serious vampires, more action oriented, more comedy oriented. And of course we've seen the classic vampire, but a few movies I really want to mention that really stood out for me. One in particular was called Bitten. Have you seen that?
Yes, I have.
Now that one had, of all people, Jason Mewes, and he finds this girl who it turns out is a vampire. He's trying to protect her, keep her safe. So the idea of the vampire romance is there, but it's definitely more in the modern side, and it's less what's the word? It's less stupid than Twilight is.
Well, and when we're talking kind of vampire comedy, there's a lot, or even things that weren't intended to be comedy. There's a whole slew of 80s, 90s style movies that we probably won't get deeply into. My babysitter's a vampire, my cousin's a vampire, Once Bitten, which was actually weirdly a pretty good show. We have all these campy 80s movies that involved vampires. So there was sort of that entire genre there. So there was this entire 80s goofy vampire genre that existed and probably did a lot to keep vampires in people's minds, even if the individual movies might not have been that great. Now, listeners, let me know if this is your favorite type of vampire movie. Let us know, and let us know what your favorite 80s schlocky vampire movie is just a must see.
Absolutely. And I can honestly say, and I mentioned earlier, this wasn't, I'm not sure what year this movie came out. I don't know if it was in the 80s, but my favorite schlocky comedy vampire, it's definitely Dracula Dead and Loving It, but I might be a little biased because, as you know, I'm a huge fan of Mel Brooks.
Oh, I totally agree. I actually feel, for one, I love anything Mel Brooks. And I feel like Dracula Dead and Loving It, weirdly, is probably a lot of people's main exposure to the story of Dracula. Because while, of course, it's very different than the story of Dracula, it shared a lot of plot beats. And if you kind of just want the Spark Notes version of Dracula, you could do worse than Dracula Dead and Loving It.
Very true. Very true.
Now, when we're talking about sometimes seen as schlocky, very complicated movies from history that were definitely a product of their time, you have to mention that Blackula exists. And Blackula was a blaxploitation vampire movie that definitely had some good elements. It's very complicated, kind of its history in cinema, but it was sort of an important movie that did exist. Now, I don't want to spend too much time on that one for obvious reasons, but I do want to mention it specifically because I feel like it's a spiritual successor to a much better version of what they were trying to do with that movie, which is A Vampire in Brooklyn. Now, if you have never seen A Vampire in Brooklyn, it contains one of the sexiest vampires in movie history, and it was played by Eddie Murphy. Just trust me on this. If you haven't watched it, you need to watch it and tell me I'm wrong because it's true. Here's the thing, the reason this is such an interesting movie, and of course, this movie is a horror comedy all the way, it's meant to be. But here's how it came to be. Eddie Murphy and Wes Craven had been wanting to do a project together for a long time. Wes Craven, of course, one of the all time great horror directors, and Eddie Murphy, who at the time was an extremely famous comedian and was at the time seen as a really great comedian. Now, they got together, decided to make a vampire movie. Well, Wes Craven's like, hey, I get an opportunity to work with Eddie Murphy. I want to make a comedy. And Eddie Murphy's like, no, I got an opportunity to work with Wes Craven. I want to do something serious and scary. I want to do straight up horror. And so after they talked about it a little bit, they split the difference by saying, okay, Wes Craven, you make the movie as a comedy. You put all the funny elements in the movie, in the characters around him. And Eddie Murphy was going to play a completely straight, serious vampire. And he does. The vampire is kind of coded as being like kind of island, Caribbean, Jamaican kind of thing. And he's very suave, very sexy, very, speaks with an island accent. He's very, very cool. And he's played deadpan serious. He's just a straight up horror movie vampire. And everyone around him, all the situations around him are very funny. Now, because Eddie Murphy is an actor and a comedian who was kind of famous for impersonating people and doing all these different characters, the vampire in this movie has the ability to shapeshift and become different people. That's what I was referencing before. Is this vampire can take on the form of anybody, and anytime in the movie that the vampire would take on someone's form, it would be Eddie Murphy playing that character. So Eddie Murphy plays like 5 or 6 characters that are always the vampire impersonating someone. And overall, as far as horror comedies go, I will always love Dracula Dead and loving it, but that one's right up there with it for me.
I'm definitely a big fan of Eddie Murphy, and as I mentioned last time, I need to watch that. I need to figure out where to stream it. But moving on from comedy, we had a lot of action vampire movies, and some of them worked very well, other ones didn't. And and I know, we both know we need to talk about Van Helsing.
For sure. And this is actually one of my friends wanted to make sure that I did Van Helsing because it's his favorite vampire movie, which is definitely a hot take because it's not most people's, but I also feel it's highly underrated. So I am happy to talk about it. One of the things I think is so cool about it is it exists because Dr. Van Helsing's name just became synonymous with Vampire Hunter to the point where I feel like the character that was represented in the book has almost been lost. Most of the time, when you think Van Helsing, you do not think of a old Danish doctor who's like a grandpa who's knowledgeable about vampires. You just think generically vampire hunter. And that's kind of where the comics of Van Helsing take it. Van Helsing has some of my favorite stuff in it. It has, for one, it has one of my favorite, if not opening lines, early lines in a movie where Van Helsing is hunting a werewolf and he's going to kill this werewolf and someone says that you shouldn't kill him and he says, "Look, if I don't kill him, he's going to murder innocent people." And they say, "Yes, but it's not his fault." And he says, "I know, but he's going to kill them anyway." I love that. I love how that shows that kind of trade-off and that kind of moral quandary you have of do you stop someone from hurting people even if they don't mean to. It also has some really cool stuff with Dracula. Yeah, again, as I mentioned before, he's the Dracula that made the deal with the devil, has the giant demon bat form. Also, we do have to talk about how the guy depicts that Dracula, which he's very much trying to do a Bela Lugosi impersonation. And Bela Lugosi was only Bela Lugosi some of the time.
Yeah.
And so I feel it's not super successful, but it could be worse. And overall, I liked it.
I actually did very much enjoy. I mean, watching it years later and rewatching it, I didn't love it as much as I did when I was in high school, but I did think he did an okay job, and I think he should have really gone in a direction of doing it his own way with Bela Lugosi's inspiration, kind of. But one scene I really loved. It's at the very beginning, the big fight scene where Frankenstein's involved and stuff. Frankenstein's monster, I should say, and he gets kind of kicked into a fireplace or something. There's an explosion. He walks out. His face is all destroyed from the explosion. He walks out like it's nothing. His face heals and he just keeps doing what he's doing. That was I just love that scene.
Oh, that's a fantastic scene.
So, we could talk about vampires in modern media all day because they're everywhere and rightly so. They're great creatures. But I really want to get to video games because that's a little bit different and a little more interesting, a little more out there. So just a few films I want to mention. Daybreakers was interesting. It's this idea that vampires have taken over the world. They farm humans for blood. It's kind of just what you'd expect. It's something to check out. Blade, of course, everybody knows Blade, and we're gonna save him for the horror and comic books, the horror and comic books episode, which is coming up in the near future. There's vampires and soap operas. We talked a little bit about that. There's this idea that vampires should be dramatic and kind of I can't think of the right word. Kind of dramatic and soap opera esque, and versus the more darker, more horror themed ones. What We Do in the Shadows, I feel like I need to mention that because we were talking about vampires and comedy. What We Do in the Shadows is absolutely brilliant, and everybody needs to watch it. We'll probably save it more for horror comedy, but my god, that show is brilliant. And there is one more idea in television that you know a bit more about this than I do, so I'll let you take the reins there. But the idea of how vampires work in Buffy, how is that exactly?
The interesting thing about vampires in Buffy, mostly they're actually staying to a lot of the traditional strengths and weaknesses. In that way, they're very traditional. But one of the things that is so unique to Buffy and then the spinoff Angel, of course, is that vampires in Buffy are not exactly a human who has been turned into a vampire. When you get bitten and turned by a vampire in Buffy, you die and your body is taken over by a demon. So these are literally demonic entities. Now they have your memories, they have some of your personality, but that's not you anymore. That is literally a demon. So that's why they're all kind of inherently evil. And once someone dies, it's sort of treated as kind of uncomplicated. You're just supposed to kill them because that's not them anymore. That's a demon. So they are literally cases of demonic possession in Buffy.
Yeah, and the only thing I have to say about that is I hate that because it's a dream of mine to be a vampire, and then it's just not me, right?
Exactly.
But anyway, folks, we can maybe do a short on things to check out in modern vampire videos, or maybe a short video on it. But we want to move ahead just a little bit to the concept of vampires in video games, because this is something I definitely want to make sure I cover. Because whether it's because of game mechanics or just trying to create something unique, there's always something interesting in video game vampires. So games in general, I should say, because we talk a bit about D&D, they're a little different in D&D. They have the typical the hierarchy we mentioned earlier, the vampire master and the younger vampires. The younger vampires have a little more autonomy, but the master vampire kind of a slave driver.
And of course, when we mention vampires in D&D, we have to talk about the Curse of Strahd and Strahd as a vampire, which is almost a direct one for one to Dracula. It's kind of their version of Dracula. And I feel like Curse of Strahd is a lot of people's favorite role-playing thing involving vampires, at least those people who have not been lucky enough to play Vampire the Masquerade.
Or World of Darkness, but same universe. But yeah, just a few more to mention. Vampires tend to show up everywhere, whether they're truly vampires or not. If we look at Resident Evil, known famously for being the zombie game, we had Lady Dimitrescu, who was a 9 foot tall vampire lady, and I'm not going to get into some of the things I read on the internet about her because this is a family podcast. It's not. I just don't want to talk about it. But the idea is that this parasite that they have and these mushroom spores or fungus spores, whatever you want to call it, kind of mutated her body, and she got this kind of how would you put it? This kind of hemophilia where she needed to consume human blood to replenish herself.
And for everyone, I will be more blunt than my co-host. We are talking about 9 foot tall vampire muscle mommy, and everyone wanted her to step on them. So definitely a fantastic character who I have no notes on.
Not much else to say, really. There's of course Asterion in Baldur's Gate 3. There's really not much to say about him other than he is the typical, the vampire you're supposed to like, the vampire you kind of gravitate towards because he's Lestat essentially, just sillier. That's what I got anyway.
I totally agree with that. He's a better version of Lestat.
And finally, something I've been waiting to talk about for a minute here, Legacy of Kain. Now, Legacy of Kain is the most amazing vampire story that a lot of you have never experienced. The interesting thing about Legacy of Kain, and we mentioned earlier how vampires existed in history before they came to be vampires. The interesting thing is we start with our character of Cain. Now, he becomes a vampire because he makes a deal with the necromancer. The necromancer brings him back to life. See, there's kind of this scene where he's surrounded by fire and tied to these two pillars with a sword through his stomach, and he says, I didn't know if I was in heaven or hell. And I wonder. I really do wonder.
I would have thought that the sword through your stomach would have been a hint. That definitely wouldn't be in my heaven, but maybe he's into some kinky stuff. I don't judge.
Oh, then there's also the fire and the screaming, and you know what? I think we're safe to assume that he's in hell.
That's true. I think that the statement of him being in this situation and not knowing if he's in heaven or hell might have meant that Cain from Legacy of Cain would have been a prime candidate for the Cenobites.
That's a possibility. I think he would have just become one though, because there's kind of a connection there. We have the character of Vorador, who I mentioned, returns with his head attached to his body, and they don't mention how it happened. Kane doesn't even say, well, "Your head's back on." How did that happen? It's just kind of there, but that's for another discussion. But anyway, Kane is brought back by a necromancer named Mortanius. Basically, I'll give you the short version of Blood Omen. He decides, or he's told that the world's going to be destroyed because the pillars are rotting. They keep balancing the world. he has to kill the guardians of the pillars so new guardians can be born. Blah blah blah. He does all that. Then he's told, you're actually the guardian of balance, so a new guardian needs to be born after you too, which means you need to die. Kane, of course, says, "Screw that! I just saved the world," and takes over. Pillars topple. He raises vampire lieutenants, and it's kind of the interesting idea of the master vampire, except like D&D, they have a lot more autonomy. And there's the idea of, we know how he became a vampire. I'm going back to the Dracula Untold thing here, but he kind of tells the whole world that he's a god. They're all afraid of him because they think he's all powerful. And a lot of people don't know he was human once. But I won't go too long on Legacy of Kain. I'm just going to tell you why it's the perfect vampire story. One, first and foremost, it does time travel right, which is very hard to do. We all know that. Two,
I will say that anytime time travel is done, if it is done right, that is immediately 100 points to whatever story does it well.
precisely. I do kind of want to bring up at one point I made a video about Legacy of Kain when they talked about the remasters. Somebody actually commented they should remake it without the time travel stuff. And for those of you who don't know, that's like saying they should remake Star Wars without all the battles in space and lightsaber fights. It's central to the plot line. But anyway, that's Kane's story in a nutshell. He is trying to save the world that he doomed to destruction, but he finds that throughout history, he's been played in so many ways, and he's trying to fix it in his own way. And the way vampires are born in that universe, it's kind of funny because we talked about how the first ones were born, but the same idea that they turn other vampires to, make them the new guardians of the pillars. Furthermore, I talked about this a bit earlier. We talked about evolution, how sometimes they'll have physical changes to themselves. That is huge in Legacy of Kain. Kain looks totally different in Soul Reaver versus how he looks in Blood Omen. And all of his lieutenants over the course of about 1,000 years change. One, in this universe, they can't touch water, it burns them. One slowly exposed himself to water and turned more and more fish like. One was he got the least of Kane's power, the least of his dark gift, as they put it. And his skin, he doesn't have full immortality, so his flesh kind of rots away. So he grafts bodies onto his body to keep himself from rotting away completely. One became really, really physically strong because all he did was fight, because that's all he liked to do. I don't want to describe all of them because I feel like we'll be getting into spoiler territory. But the whole story really starts with Raziel getting wings before everybody else. And I mentioned earlier the ancient vampire relatives, the ancient vampire ancestors, were winged beings. So that's kind of a sign of divinity. He doesn't know that, but Cain knows that. So Cain gets jealous, rips his wings off, tosses them to the abyss, and he becomes kind of a psychic vampire. He feeds on souls. He becomes a wraith. I don't want to go on too long a monologue about Legacy of Kain, but I do want to mention this, folks. December 10th, the remasters of Soul Reaver and Soul Reaver 2 are coming out. Trust me, buy them. You will not be disappointed.
Cool. I think that kind of leads us into our wrap up, right?
Yep, I think we're coming up on the end here. We've talked a lot about vampires and what they are and their biology. Do you have anything to add to any of that?
All I can really say is that I feel that one of the most interesting things about vampires and kind of why we started this as a how to kill a vampire is I feel like how their weaknesses and their strengths differ is one of the things that makes vampires so interesting. If there was one canonical type of vampire and every vampire was exactly the same, I don't feel like vampire media would be anywhere near as interesting. I feel like it's the differences. It's how every time I'm going to go to write a story or make a movie or a video game that involves vampires, I've got this big box of toys to play with and I can put them together like Legos. If I want my vampires to be more bestial, if I want them to be more demony, if I want them, which another word for that would be demonic, but I'm going with demony apparently. If I want them to have greater, more superhero-esque powers, if I want them to have bloodlust, there's all these elements that I can put together to make cool vampires, and they're all going to be different and they're all unique. And I feel that's what the key to why vampires are so cool in modern media is.
On the note of the toy box, before we do wrap up, I do want to talk about one other thing we mentioned early on. Our favorite creations as writers, as tabletop gamers, whatever. What was your favorite vampiric creation of your own?
My favorite vampiric creation of all time is a short story that I wrote. It's actually more of a microfiction. It's very, very short. It's on our website on the Gray Matters blog if anyone ever wants to check it out. And it is a short story called Not Enough Time in Forever. And the reason I wrote this is because in so much vampire media, you see the thing that, oh, immortality is a curse, and it's so horrible to see the people around you die, and that if you were to live that long, you wouldn't want to. And I and you see that depicted so much with vampires who live a really long time, just wanting to end it all and not wanting the immortality that they have. So I wrote an entire story about this vampire who's very depressed, sitting in a bar, lamenting because he just lost someone important to him because they were human and they died of old age. And he ends up talking to this other person who he finds out is a vampire, and then finds out this other vampire is much, much older than him. It's even implied this might be the very first vampire. So it's this very, very ancient vampire, and basically telling him, yeah, this feeling about immortality where it's time seems so long, that's a phase, you'll grow out of it. And how that starts asking him all these questions. How many languages do you speak? What have you been doing with your time? And the idea that there's so many cool things you could be doing with your eternity, it's only empty and pointless if you make it empty and pointless, because there's not enough time to do every amazing thing you'd want to. There's not enough time in forever, which is the title of the story.
See, my personal favorite, in another direction, was a character I made for World of Darkness or Vampire the Masquerade. A friend of mine put out this idea for his universe, wherein there were going to be a set of characters who each represent a certain human. What's the right word? A certain human failing. It might be like a deadly, like one of the deadly sins. It might be just straight up malice. That's the character trait that I rolled. We all rolled to see which one we get. So my character was what they called the incarnation of malice, and he was a vampire. So I wrote a bit of a history for him. He grew up in Russia during one of their worst depressions, monetarily speaking. Grew up with no food, and basically had to hunt to survive a lot of the time. And as he's growing up, I remember watching this serial killer documentary way back in the day where somebody mentions what it was like in Russia at that time, and they said, it's terrifying. If you see somebody walking up the street and they're well fed and fat, that means they're probably engaging in cannibalism, and that's yeah, that's a big part of how I wrote his character. So he's barely living his life, I should say, when one day he's cornered by some people who, well, they want to eat him, and he meets a vampire. I never named this vampire, I'm sorry. And the vampire tells him, I can help you turn the tables, and he obviously gets him out of the situation, and he needs a sire, so to speak. So he gets him out of that situation, blah blah blah. He makes the deal with him. He becomes a vampire. Now, when he becomes a vampire, that thing in him awakens, that element of malice, and he's angry. He's very angry at literally everything around him, everyone around him who's stealing from each other, this and that. And he starts finding new ways to, how should I put this? We're not on TikTok. I can say what I want. He starts finding new ways to kill people before he eats them. He starts seeing how much of their blood he can drink before they die of blood loss, that sort of thing. Eventually, he finds his way over to America and he starts his kind of own vampire. Well, he doesn't start a vampire coven, but he's got his own followers and so forth. And yeah, that's his whole idea. He's just this really kind of malicious guy. He has a knife he's had since he was a kid. He calls oh god, what name did I give it? I gave it a stereotypically Russian female name. I don't remember what it was, but I had a lot of fun playing him.
And I love the idea of a character like that being based in real world horror, like the idea of the cannibalism. If someone's walking around fat, you know that they're eating people, and having that be the basis for supernatural horror. I love that.
I'm a big fan too. Well, I wrote that, so I'm a big fan.
So, Hatter, do we want to give people kind of a sneak peek of what our next episode is going to be?
Yes, yes, I do. We mentioned it a few times throughout the video, and I really want to delve into the world of angels and demons next.
Absolutely, because religious horror is again one of those wells you can keep going back to. Has so much fascinating stuff in it, and the specific element. Because again, we are a niche horror podcast where we talk about oddly specific topics, and we're going to be talking about angels and demons, going into how they've influenced horror, how the folklore and beliefs of actual people influence the horror, and how angels and demons are depicted in horror. And I think it's going to be fantastic, guys. We have a ton of material for this, and I think you're really going to enjoy it.
So until next time, folks, I am the Hatter.
And I am Gray, and thank you for joining us on the Station Between Stations as we delve into the dark corners of all horror and bring you weirdly specific horror topics.